It was a crisp Monday morning when Kendra Adams left her house, the early morning sun casting long shadows on the sidewalk as she made her way to the car. The city was just waking up, with the familiar hum of traffic in the distance and the quiet bustle of the neighborhood filling the air. Kendra, a black woman in her late 30s, was no different from any other working professional, moving through her daily routine with a sense of purpose. She had a job to do, a case to prep for, and the usual hurdles of the day ahead. But this morning was different in a way she couldn't yet put her finger on. She waved to a neighbor walking their dog as she passed by, the small acts of kindness that made her feel grounded in her community. Despite her busy schedule as a judge, she always tried to stay connected with the people in her neighborhood. She was one of the few African American women in her position, and Kendra was proud of the work she had done to break down barriers in the legal system, especially in a town where tensions between the police and communities of color had been strained for years. Her mind wandered to the cases she would be handling that day. Kendra had become known for her fair but firm approach to the law, never afraid to make tough decisions, even if they were unpopular. Yet, even she couldn't ignore the occasional doubt that crept in. She had been working tirelessly for years to prove that she deserved her seat on the bench. But being a black woman in a predominantly white town, there were still moments where she felt the weight of others' biases, unspoken and sometimes even blatant. She got into her car, her thoughts momentarily lost in the sound of the engine starting. As she drove through the town, her gaze drifted to the police station. It wasn't far from where she lived, and she'd passed it many times, but today, her thoughts lingered. Two officers from the station, Officer Peterson and Officer Daniels, had become almost infamous around the community. They were well known for their aggressive policing tactics, particularly toward people of color. Kendra had seen them in action, heard the stories from her neighbors. It wasn't unusual to hear complaints about how the two officers seemed to think they were above the law. She'd crossed paths with them before in passing, quick exchanges at the local coffee shop or in the courthouse, but they never seemed to pay her any mind. Kendra was used to it. She was just another woman in their eyes, one whose presence didn't command much attention. It wasn't that she lacked authority, on the contrary, her reputation as a judge was solid, but in those brief encounters, she could tell they didn't see her as anyone of importance. They saw a black woman, and their assumptions were immediate. This particular morning, as Kendra turned onto a side street, her thoughts were interrupted by the flashing blue lights of a police car pulling up behind her. She didn't panic. Routine traffic stops were part of life, but as she eased the car to the side of the road, she felt a small knot form in her stomach. It was Peterson and Daniels, the very same officers she'd thought about earlier. As the car came to a stop, she could already tell by the way they approached the vehicle that they were in a familiar rhythm, acting as if they were in charge of the situation, completely unaware of the woman they were dealing with. Officer Peterson tapped on the window. "License and registration," he said curtly, not even meeting her eyes. He was in his mid-40s, his face hardened by years of policing, his posture rigid with authority. Behind him, Officer Daniels stood with his arms crossed, his expression distant but filled with a certain arrogance. Kendra reached for her purse, her movements slow and deliberate. As she handed over her documents, she couldn't help but notice the dismissive way they looked at her, the air of superiority radiating off them. It was a small thing, a glance, a pause before speaking, but it was enough. They weren't just stopping her because of some minor infraction, they had already judged her, made assumptions based on her appearance. "Where are you headed?" Peterson asked, his voice giving off the kind of condescending tone that irked her, even though she kept her face neutral. "To work," Kendra replied simply, her hand still resting on the steering wheel. She could feel her heart rate slightly increase, but she remained calm. She'd learned long ago how to deal with this kind of condescension. What bothered her wasn't the routine stop, but the way they treated her like she didn't belong, like she was just another black woman on the road, someone who could be questioned, stopped, and judged on a whim. "To work, huh?" Officer Daniels chimed in, his tone almost mocking. "What do you do?" Kendra's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, making sure her composure stayed intact. This was the moment. The moment she could either let it go or reveal who she really was. She'd never been one to boast, but there was something about the way they spoke to her that made her want to make them understand, at least for a moment, who they were dealing with. "I'm a judge," she said, keeping her voice steady. There was a pause. Both officers stood there, frozen, as if the words didn't quite register. Kendra watched them through the rearview mirror, her own calm mirroring the tension in the air. Officer Peterson blinked, and for a split second, there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but it quickly disappeared. He cleared his throat, trying to recover his usual posture of control. "A judge?" Officer Daniels repeated, clearly taken aback, but he didn't ask any more questions. He simply handed back her documents, his face now redder than before. Kendra smiled to herself, a tight, knowing smile. It was a small victory, her identity had shattered their assumptions, but the encounter wasn't over yet. As she drove away, she could feel the weight of what had just happened. The officers would never see her the same way again. The story of the woman they had underestimated was one that would stick with them, even if they didn't know the half of it. Kendra wasn't just a judge, she was a force to be reckoned with, and she would prove it, one case at a time. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly guessed, was that this moment of surprise was only the beginning. The real test would come soon enough, when they found out just how deep her power went. The encounter with Officer Peterson and Officer Daniels lingered in Kendra's mind as she continued on her way to the courthouse. She couldn't help but replay the scene over and over, each moment of their surprise at her words, each flicker of disbelief on their faces. She felt a surge of pride that she had stood her ground without letting their condescension faze her. But there was a deep, quiet frustration bubbling beneath the surface, too. Why did it always have to be like this? Why did people like them assume that just because she was a black woman, she couldn't possibly be someone of authority? She knew the answers, of course. It was a reflection of the deep-seated biases in the system, the kind of prejudice that never fully went away, no matter how much progress had been made. Kendra arrived at the courthouse just as the morning session was beginning. She walked into the courtroom with the same grace and confidence that had always defined her. She was used to the weight of the job, the stares, the judgments, but she had long ago learned to block it all out. As the gavel came down and the proceedings began, Kendra shifted her focus entirely to the task at hand. The court cases before her were complex, the stakes high, and the room filled with the usual tension. But today, her mind kept wandering back to the police officers, to the way they had treated her like just another face in the crowd, someone to be easily dismissed. It wasn't the first time she had dealt with that kind of treatment, being overlooked, being underestimated, but this morning felt different. It felt personal. Maybe it was because of how brazenly they had sized her up, how blatantly they had dismissed her authority without even knowing who she was. Kendra was no stranger to dealing with ignorance, but this was a reminder of just how far the system still had to go. She understood the inner workings of the law, the subtleties and politics behind it. But sometimes, she wished it were simpler. Sometimes, she wished it didn't have to come down to proving herself over and over again. As the day wore on, Kendra's mind remained preoccupied with the two officers. She hadn't seen them again after the brief encounter, but she knew it wouldn't be the last time. Something in her gut told her that they wouldn't let this moment slide so easily. She couldn't quite pinpoint what it was, but she had a sense that this wasn't just about a routine traffic stop. There was a tension in the air that wasn't there before, a silent anticipation that the officers might make her pay for her defiance in some way. The following week, Kendra's hunch seemed to be confirmed. She was reviewing a case when she received a call from her assistant, who mentioned that Officer Peterson and Officer Daniels were scheduled to appear in her courtroom. It wasn't unusual for law enforcement to be involved in the cases she presided over, but the fact that it was those two officers, the ones who had so recently dismissed her, felt almost like fate. Kendra had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but she knew this would be different. The officers, who had probably assumed they were untouchable in their roles, were about to face a judge who had no tolerance for bias or injustice. As she prepared for the hearing, Kendra couldn't help but think about how the officers would react when they saw her on the other side of the bench. She had no plans to confront them directly, they were there to face their own misconduct, after all. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this was a critical moment for both herself and the community. What had started as a small interaction had the potential to ripple out and change everything. She couldn't afford to let it go unnoticed. This was her chance to demonstrate, not just to Peterson and Daniels but to the entire town, what it meant to stand firm in the face of prejudice. The courtroom was quiet as the officers entered, their usual air of superiority somewhat diminished by the seriousness of the case at hand. Kendra watched as they took their seats, her expression unreadable. As the case proceeded, she could sense the tension between them and her, the unspoken question of whether they would challenge her decisions, whether they still believed they could manipulate the system. Kendra was used to dealing with difficult cases, with defendants and attorneys who tried to sway her judgments. But this was different. This was personal. She couldn't afford to show weakness. As the officers took the stand to testify in a case involving police misconduct, Kendra's thoughts were razor-sharp. She had reviewed the evidence beforehand, and it was clear to her that they were lying about key details. They were trying to cover up their actions, to paint a picture of innocence that didn't match the facts. Kendra's eyes never left them as they spoke, her mind processing every word, every gesture, every attempt to dodge the truth. When it came time for her to cross-examine, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. The officers, sensing the pressure, shifted in their seats, trying to maintain their composure. Kendra stood up, her voice calm but authoritative. "Officer Peterson, Officer Daniels," she began, "let's go over your version of events one more time." She laid out the facts, one by one, the contradictions in their testimony laid bare for everyone to see. She asked questions they couldn't answer, pointed out inconsistencies in their story, and methodically dismantled their defense. As she spoke, Kendra couldn't help but feel a sense of justice unfolding. This was what she had worked so hard for, not just for herself, but for the entire community. She wasn't just ruling on a case, she was showing everyone in the room what it meant to hold people in power accountable. The officers, who had once seen her as just another black woman to dismiss, now had no choice but to face her authority, and they didn't like it one bit. When the proceedings ended, Kendra felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, but there was also a quiet satisfaction. She had done her job, and she had done it with integrity. The officers may have been surprised by her, but they would never forget this moment. The town, too, was watching, and though Kendra couldn't know it yet, this case would be remembered for a long time. It would serve as a reminder that no matter how powerful someone thought they were, justice would always prevail, especially when those who wielded it took their duty seriously. Later that evening, as Kendra sat at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The day's events had been heavy, but they had also shown her something important. The officers had underestimated her, but their mistake wasn't just a personal one. It was a reflection of the larger issue at play, the biases that ran deep in the system, the assumptions that were made based on skin color, gender, and background. Kendra had stood tall, but it wasn't just for her, it was for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced. But she knew this wasn't over. The officers would be back, and next time, the stakes would be even higher. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind for Kendra. Word had spread quickly about the court case involving Officer Peterson and Officer Daniels. The officers had been found guilty of misconduct, their lies exposed, their authority challenged by the very person they had tried to dismiss. It wasn't just the outcome of the case that sent ripples through the town, it was the realization that someone in a position of power was holding people accountable, even when those people wore badges. Kendra could feel the shift in the atmosphere, like the air had become thick with both hope and tension. She had made her mark, and it wasn't just in the legal sense. Her decision had ignited a fire in the community, a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface for years. While the officer's actions had consequences, Kendra knew the true weight of the situation wouldn't be fully understood for some time. The town had seen her strength in that courtroom, but the deeper, more complex battle lay in what happened next. The real question wasn't just about her victory, it was about what would change after the case. She couldn't help but wonder if her actions had truly made a difference or if this would all fade into the background, another headline lost to time. As she returned to her usual routine, Kendra found herself reflecting on the larger implications of what had transpired. The case had been a personal victory, but it also brought to light the very real and systemic problems within law enforcement. It wasn't just Officer Peterson and Officer Daniels, there were many more like them, many more officers who believed they were above reproach, many more people who felt untouchable because of the power they held. Kendra couldn't allow herself to become complacent. The victory wasn't the end, it was the beginning. One evening, as she sat in her office, sorting through the usual stack of paperwork, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from a community activist named Marcus, someone she had crossed paths with over the years. He was known for his outspoken views on police reform and his efforts to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Kendra had always admired Marcus's passion, though she hadn't always agreed with his methods. His call, though, came as a surprise. "Kendra, I've been following the case," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "You did something big. Something people are talking about, and they're noticing." Kendra leaned back in her chair, sensing the weight of his words. "I did what I had to do, Marcus. The law is the law, no matter who's involved." "I get that," Marcus said. "But you don't understand. People are talking about the way you stood up to them, the way you held them accountable. It's more than just a case. This is something that can change things." Kendra felt a mix of unease and curiosity. She had always kept her distance from the activism world, choosing instead to focus on her job, on making decisions based on the law and the facts in front of her. But there was something about Marcus's words that struck a chord. Maybe it was time to confront the bigger issue, the deep-rooted corruption and biases that plagued the system. "I appreciate what you're saying, Marcus, but I'm not sure I can be the person to lead a movement," Kendra replied, her voice thoughtful. "I'm a judge. My job is to rule, not to make speeches or lead protests." "Don't sell yourself short," Marcus responded, his tone soft but insistent. "What you did wasn't just about a court ruling. You took a stand in a system that's broken, and people are watching you. People are asking, what's next? If you don't step up, they'll keep waiting for someone else to do it." Kendra sat in silence, her thoughts racing. She had spent so many years focusing on her career, on proving herself in a system that wasn't built for people like her. She had worked hard to get to where she was, but in doing so, she had kept a part of herself hidden, the part of her that wanted to fight for something bigger than herself. Could she really take that next step? Could she, a black woman in a position of power, challenge the very system that had tried to hold her down for so long? Over the next few days, Kendra found herself torn between her responsibilities as a judge and the call for change that seemed to grow louder with each passing hour. She knew that the community needed leadership, that the voices of the marginalized needed to be heard, and that the town had witnessed something powerful in that courtroom. But how far was she willing to go? Would speaking out cost her the career she had worked so hard to build? Was she ready to put everything on the line for a cause that could take her down a path she wasn't prepared for? And they weren't afraid to make their displeasure known. The tension came to a head one afternoon when Kendra received an anonymous letter. It was brief, chilling, and filled with threats, warnings to back off, to stop meddling with things that didn't concern her. The letter didn't specify who had sent it, but the veiled threat was clear. Kendra wasn't naive. She knew that speaking out came with consequences, but reading those words made her realize just how high the stakes had become. Her job, her safety, and her reputation were now at risk, and it wasn't just about her anymore. The letter was a reminder of the forces that would stop at nothing to protect the status quo. But for all the fear that gnawed at her, Kendra couldn't back down. She had already come too far, and there was no turning back. That night, as she sat alone in her office, reading through case files and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Kendra thought about what it meant to truly take a stand. It wasn't just about one courtroom decision or one case, it was about a lifetime of being forced to prove herself, of navigating a system that had often overlooked her. She thought about Officer Peterson and Officer Daniels, about how their arrogance had almost derailed everything she stood for. But it wasn't just about them. It was about the countless others who had faced similar bias, the families who had been torn apart by injustice, and the communities that had been left behind for far too long. Kendra knew that the work wasn't done. The battle for justice had only just begun. The town had seen one victory, but there were countless more to fight. The officer's misconduct was just one example, but it was part of a larger pattern, one that had been ignored for far too long. Kendra's decision to speak up had brought attention to the cracks in the system, but now the real challenge was holding those in power accountable. It wasn't enough to just expose the truth, it was about changing the way things were done, about creating a system where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality for everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background. But as she began to plan the next steps, Kendra felt the walls of her world closing in. The threats, the pressure from her colleagues, and the growing tension in the community were all weighing heavily on her. She found herself questioning if she could really take on this responsibility, if she could balance her duties as a judge with the demand for social change that was now expected of her. It wasn't just about ruling on cases anymore. It was about changing the very nature of the system itself. In the midst of this internal conflict, Kendra received a call that would change everything. It was from the state governor's office, a call that had been months in the making. The governor wanted to meet with her, to discuss a potential new position. One that would give her even more influence and a platform to address the very issues she had been raising. It was an offer that many would consider the pinnacle of a legal career, an opportunity to have a direct hand in shaping policies and pushing for reforms at the highest level. But as Kendra listened to the details of the offer, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of uncertainty. This was what she had always worked toward, a chance to make a difference at a higher level. But it also meant stepping away from the bench, stepping away from the very community she had fought for. Kendra wasn't sure if she was ready to give up the position that had given her so much power, the position that had allowed her to act as a guardian of justice in the courtroom. Was it worth it? Was it worth sacrificing the life she had built in order to fight for something bigger? And what would the community think if she took this offer? Would they see it as a betrayal, as abandoning the fight for justice from within the system? As Kendra grappled with these questions, she couldn't help but think back to the moment she had first taken a stand in the courtroom, when Officer Peterson and Officer Daniels had underestimated her. That moment had been a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire community. It had shown everyone that one person could make a difference, that one voice could challenge the status quo. And now, as she stood on the brink of another pivotal moment, Kendra knew that the choices she made would shape the future not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, that they weren't enough. Kendra wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she knew she had the power to shape it. And no matter which path she chose, she was no longer just a judge in a courtroom, she was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had dared to challenge the system and had emerged stronger for it. The fight was far from over, but Kendra was ready to face whatever came next. She was ready to take the next step. The days that followed were a whirlwind of decisions, self-reflection, and uncharted territory. Kendra's name had become a symbol of hope, an emblem of change in a town that had long been divided. Everywhere she went, people approached her with respect, with gratitude, and often with questions. They wanted to know what she would do next. Would she take the governor's offer? Would she continue to fight from within the system, or would she become an outspoken advocate for reform, leading the charge for a new way of doing things? But with all the praise came the weight of expectation. Kendra could feel the eyes of the town on her, the pressure mounting with each passing day. The calls from activists grew louder, urging her to use her newfound influence to push for sweeping changes. Some saw her as the one person who could bridge the gap between the community and law enforcement. Others were more skeptical, questioning whether she would truly follow through or whether this was just another political maneuver. Every decision she made seemed to matter more than the last, and Kendra couldn't help but feel a sense of being trapped in a role she hadn't asked for but had somehow come to embody. It was a sleepless night when she realized that she couldn't keep going on like this. The pressure had become too great, and she had been avoiding the most important question of all: what did she want? She had spent her entire career building a reputation, working tirelessly to rise through the ranks of the judicial system, but now, faced with the choice to either stay within that system or step outside it to take on an entirely new role, Kendra knew she had to make a decision that wasn't about pleasing anyone else. It had to be about what was right for her. She had spent so much time fighting the battles of others, trying to prove herself in a system that was stacked against her, that she had lost sight of what she truly wanted out of life. The governor's offer was tempting. The power and influence that came with the position would allow her to make a difference on a larger scale, but it would also mean stepping away from the very work she loved, the work that had given her purpose. The courtroom had always been her sanctuary, her place of clarity, where the rules were clear, and justice could be served. Could she leave that behind for a chance to change the system from the outside, to challenge the very thing she had spent her career upholding? Kendra found herself torn between the two paths. The decision wasn't just about her career, it was about what kind of legacy she wanted to leave. She knew that taking the governor's offer would give her a platform to push for real change, but it also meant giving up her position as a judge, where she had always been able to act as an impartial arbiter of justice. Could she still be a voice for the voiceless, a force for justice, if she left the very role that had defined her for so long? Days turned into weeks, and Kendra continued to wrestle with these thoughts, searching for an answer that would give her peace. She knew that no matter what decision she made, it would have consequences. If she stayed, she could continue to effect change from within, to challenge the system with every ruling she made. But if she left, if she took the governor's offer, she could be a true advocate for the people, pushing for reform at the highest levels of government. It was a daunting choice, one that no one could make for her. And as much as she valued the opinions of those around her, it was ultimately Kendra who had to live with the consequences. One evening, as she sat on the porch of her home, watching the sunset over the town, Kendra finally had a moment of clarity. The decision wasn't as complicated as she had made it out to be. She didn't have to choose between one path or the other. She had spent so much time trying to fit herself into a mold that others had created for her. But in that moment, Kendra realized that she could carve out her own path. She didn't need to conform to expectations or follow a predetermined route. She could be both a judge and an advocate. She could use her position to fight for justice, and she could step outside the courtroom to push for the broader systemic changes that were so desperately needed. Her decision became clear: she would accept the governor's offer, but she would do so with the intent of using her new role to bring change to the very system that had once felt so restrictive. She would work from the inside and the outside, using both her influence and her voice to challenge the status quo. She would no longer be defined by the limitations of the system, she would reshape it to better serve the people it was meant to protect. Kendra knew that it wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, both from within the system and from those who didn't want to see change. But she had never been one to shy away from a challenge. She had fought for everything she had achieved in her life, and she wasn't about to stop now. Her journey had only just begun, and the fight for justice would continue, not just in the courtroom, but in every corner of society. As Kendra made the decision to step into this new role, the community began to rally behind her. People from all walks of life reached out to offer their support, to express their hope that she would be the leader they had been waiting for. Her decision wasn't just about her, it was about the future of the entire community. Kendra had become a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of change. And while she knew the road ahead would be difficult, she also knew that she had the strength to face whatever came her way. The moment she accepted the governor's offer, Kendra felt a surge of purpose, a sense of readiness that she hadn't felt in years. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would take her beyond the courtroom, but never away from her commitment to justice. The system had tried to break her, had tried to force her into a box, but Kendra had refused to be confined. Now, she would use every ounce of her power and influence to dismantle the very system that had tried to hold her down. As Kendra settled into her new role, the pace of life shifted dramatically. The governor's office was a labyrinth of meetings, policy discussions, and decisions that carried weight far beyond what she had experienced in the courtroom. Each day was a new challenge, and though she was no longer sitting behind the judge's bench, the fight for justice continued in a different, but equally significant, way. The issues she had championed before, police reform, racial justice, accountability, had only deepened in complexity, and the pressure to create meaningful change was more immediate than ever. At first, the transition was overwhelming. The office was a maze of paperwork, legal jargon, and constant meetings with people who were often more concerned with political ramifications than the human impact of the decisions they made. Kendra, however, never lost sight of why she had taken the position in the first place. She had seen the cracks in the system firsthand. She had watched as the justice system failed to protect those who needed it the most. Now, she had the opportunity, and the responsibility, to fix it from the top down. In the months that followed, Kendra worked tirelessly to push for the reforms that were so desperately needed. She became a vocal advocate for police accountability, for fair treatment of marginalized communities, and for greater transparency in the justice system. And while there were many who resisted her efforts, there were just as many who supported her, who believed in her vision for a better future. Through it all, Kendra never forgot where she came from or the people who had put their trust in her. She continued to fight for those who had been overlooked, for those who had been silenced, and for those who had never had a voice. And in doing so, she became a true leader, not just in her town, but in the larger fight for justice and equality. Kendra had taken the risks, had made the difficult decisions, and had paved the way for a future where justice was not just an ideal, but a reality for everyone. Her first months in office were focused on gathering information, building alliances, and understanding the intricate layers of the bureaucracy she now navigated. But despite the constraints of the system, Kendra was determined to push for change. She initiated discussions with various advocacy groups, law enforcement leaders, and citizens to hear directly from those who had felt the brunt of systemic inequalities. It wasn't just about hearing their complaints, it was about understanding their experiences, building a coalition of voices that could help reform the system in ways that were impactful and sustainable. Her first significant action was to launch a series of statewide community forums, where people could voice their concerns and offer solutions directly to her office. These forums were unlike anything she had seen before. They were not simply places where the public could air grievances, they were spaces of real dialogue, where Kendra listened with intention and allowed those most affected by the system to shape the conversation. The forums were filled with emotion, with raw stories of trauma and perseverance, and they gave Kendra a deeper understanding of the scope of the issue at hand. Despite her efforts to remain neutral and impartial, Kendra soon found herself caught in a web of political maneuvering. Some lawmakers supported her, seeing her as a champion for change, while others viewed her as a threat to the established order. The more she pushed for reform, the more she faced resistance from those who had long benefited from the status quo. She was called radical, divisive, even unqualified by some of her detractors. They accused her of ignoring the needs of law enforcement, of undermining the very institutions she had once been a part of. But Kendra had never been one to shy away from a challenge. The criticism stung, but it only fueled her determination. She knew that the work ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was more prepared for this than ever before. The weight of her position wasn't lost on her. She had fought for years to be taken seriously in a field dominated by men and a system that had consistently pushed against her. Now, she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for a generation of people who had been overlooked, unheard, and oppressed by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. Her work began to bear fruit when, a few months into her term, she was able to broker an agreement with the state police to implement new training programs focused on de-escalation techniques, community engagement, and anti-bias practices. It was a small but significant victory. These programs would not solve the problem overnight, but they were a crucial first step toward creating a police force that was more in touch with the communities they served. The ripple effect was immediate. Community leaders praised her for her leadership, and there were even signs of a shift in local law enforcement. Officers who had once resisted change began to see the benefits of Kendra's reforms, particularly in the areas of reducing tensions and building trust with the public. But for every victory, there were setbacks. Kendra's approach to reform was often met with resistance from various corners of the political landscape. Some viewed her initiatives as too radical, while others saw them as insufficient. The balancing act between pushing for systemic change while maintaining enough political support to get things done was a constant struggle. Every decision was scrutinized, every policy analyzed for potential flaws. Kendra was under the constant weight of being the face of a movement, and though she remained steadfast in her mission, there were moments of doubt. One such moment came during a particularly tense meeting with the state police union. The union had expressed strong opposition to the new training programs, arguing that they were unnecessary and would create additional burdens on officers. Kendra had always prided herself on listening to both sides, but in this meeting, the union's stance seemed unyielding. They painted her as someone who didn't understand the challenges of law enforcement, as someone who was more concerned with optics than with the realities of police work. The meeting ended with no agreement, and Kendra felt the sting of the confrontation. She was frustrated but not defeated. It was in moments like these that Kendra felt the weight of the position she had taken on. The pressure from all sides, activists, politicians, law enforcement, and the media, was constant. But as the days wore on, Kendra began to lean into the discomfort. She had always known that real change would come at a cost. She had spent years building her career, earning respect as a judge, and she was not about to let that all go to waste. The fight for justice was bigger than any one person or any single piece of legislation. The turning point came when Kendra was invited to speak at a national conference on criminal justice reform. The opportunity to speak on a national stage was both exhilarating and terrifying. She would be addressing a room full of policymakers, advocates, and experts, many of whom had been working on these issues for years. But it was also a chance to show the country that real, substantive change could come from people who were committed to the work, not just the rhetoric. Kendra spent weeks preparing for the speech, knowing that it had the potential to shape the future of her career and the movement she had become a part of. On the day of the conference, Kendra stood before the crowd, her nerves giving way to a quiet confidence. She spoke not just as a judge or a politician, but as someone who had seen the injustice firsthand. She spoke for the people who had been silenced, for the families who had been torn apart by an inequitable system. She spoke for the future, for the next generation that would not have to face the same struggles. Her words resonated with the audience, and when she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before the applause began. It wasn't just a victory for her, it was a victory for everyone who had fought for justice in the face of adversity. Kendra's journey was far from over. As she continued her work in the governor's office, she remained steadfast in her commitment to justice, knowing that every step forward was a victory, no matter how small. The fight for reform would be a long one, but with every policy, every conversation, and every decision, Kendra knew she was inching closer to a more just society. She had become more than just a judge, more than just a politician, she had become a catalyst for change, a force to be reckoned with. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Kendra knew one thing for sure: she would keep pushing, keep fighting, and keep making a difference, no matter the cost.